Good morning. So everybody, it's great to see some familiar faces and some new ones. My name is Roger Reid. I represent Innovative Interfaces in this region, and I'm really excited to introduce and chair today's session by Dr. Genevieve Bell. Now, Innovative has been helping libraries for close to 30 years in this region, and we've seen a lot of change that's been pushed by technology, such as workflow automation. I'm sure everybody in this room has been touched by that key topic. The digitization of content and also the systems that you use to discover that content. And overall, the trend is to push your services to an online environment so you can serve many more wherever they choose to be. But many of us are still caught up in our fear of letting go of the old ways. And I actually say that vendors are actually predominantly in that camp. So every year, the recurring theme since I've been in this industry, in every trade show that I've gone to, has been how do you make data talk to data? And how do you actually keep up with the likes of Google and YouTube that are enthralling your customers out there? So the first step is to remove the boundaries between your data. And we've done this in our next generation platform. We're one of the first in the industry to release a native linked data architecture that ensures that you get to maximize on all of those years of data curation that you've been through. Now, the next step is to automate the way that we make sense of this data. It's simply not possible for any human to take that task on. So we need a system that can do this in an automated and intelligent way, and that's where Innovative see artificial intelligence coming into the picture. So, Genevieve's Keynote is about artificial intelligence, and more importantly, it's framed by how it can help us, and in her words, experience the notion of wonder, beauty, discomfort, and doubt. That is, to challenge us all to think differently. You see, AI is already mingling in the data spheres that make up our digital and online personas. It's already here, and it's already changing the game. And in the library world, this means a variety of things. And if you just imagine a little with me, we're talking about virtual librarian services, virtual research assistants, generally virtual knowledge coaches, delighting people at scale along the way wherever they are. Genevieve is a self-proclaimed non-expert in AI, her background and vantage point being that of a cultural anthropologist and futurist, having worked at ANU, Intel, and more recently as a director for CBA. Genevieve has a point of view that is welcome and necessary in what is the dawn of this next industrial age. Everyone, please give the warmest of welcomes to Dr. Bell.
Well, that's always daunting. It's always good to hear what you're going to talk about and realise that somewhere between the program and now you've changed your mind, which I feel is a time-honoured tradition at every academic conference I've ever been to, so I reckon I'm in good steads. Listen, I too want to acknowledge that we meet on Aboriginal country. I want to pay my respects to the Gadigal and the Eora people and to Indigenous people throughout this country. It's always striking to me, having spent 30 years living overseas, that one of the things I most love about coming home is that every event begins by recognising where we actually are, both in time and in space and in culture. And it is striking to me, having spent 30 years living in America, that it is a place where they never acknowledge that they meet on Aboriginal country and they never pay their respects to the traditional elders. So coming home and being able to do that is for me always both a joy and a responsibility, and never actually a ritual that you pass through quickly. So it was glorious to listen to the various acknowledgements of that this morning. I am, among my many other features, the child of an anthropologist, and I grew up on Aboriginal country in the Northern Territory in the 1970s and 1980s, and that was a remarkable childhood. And I was lucky about what I was taught and what it left me with. It's also the case that I know whenever we talk about the future, which I plan to do here, we should do that grounded in the reality that we live in a place that always built the future. People stood here over the last 15 minutes and talked about the fact that we live in a place that's been continuously occupied for 60,000 years. That means we live in a place where the future has been continuously built for 60,000 years. So as we stand and want to talk about the future, we should do it mindful of the fact we aren't the first people to do so. In fact, less than 380 miles, 790 kilometres, give or take, going north and west from here, you would come to the town of Bawarrina, that sits on the New South Wales-Queensland border at the meeting of a different set of rivers. Were you to go to Bawarana and were you to drive through town, if you were going east, you'd take a left right before you get to the tourist bureau, and you would go to the river. And in the river, you would find, poorly signed, but very visible, a set of fish traps. Those fish traps were, according to the most recent archaeological reports, built nearly 40,000 years ago. That means 40,000 years ago, the indigenous people in that region worked out how to tame the rivers of Australia. They worked out how to manage water that flowed over a 3-metre drop using 9 separate weirs built with stones carted from other places. They worked out how to adjust the water levels and the water rates. They created multiple ponds that stored multiple different kinds of fish, releasing them so that they could spawn further down the river or creating a surplus so that they could feed the people who gathered at those rivers. That system was last recorded to be used in the 1930s in oral histories from that region. That means in our country there is a technical system that survived 40,000 years. We can make jokes about microfiche and its sustainability. We can worry about the collections that we have in our libraries and our archives, but we should know that we also live in a place where technical systems have lasted longer than any of us can imagine. And what it means to think of being responsible for that and building against that backdrop is, for me, one of the great privileges and responsibilities of my life. So, I too want to acknowledge that we meet on Aboriginal country with everything that means. So, all right, let's change gears. I want to talk about AI, but I don't want to talk about it in the conventional ways because I reckon you're going to hear lots of talks about that today. I'm sure you will hear people talk about algorithms and data and talk about different forms of, as Rox just reminded me, robots in the library. I want to take the conversation in a slightly different direction and take the advantage of being one of the early speakers to kind of pose the question about, rather than thinking about the instrumentalists' use of technology, can we also think about the ways they might deliver new kinds of experiences? For me, ones that are about creativity, wonder, beauty, art, indeed discomfort, and perhaps just a little bit of what's possible. So who am I to tell you all of that? Well, clearly, I'm not a librarian. Despite what it says on my business card, I'm not actually a professor of computer science or engineering. I am indeed an anthropologist, and I'm the daughter of an anthropologist. And as I just mentioned, I grew up on my mother's field sites in central and northern Australia. I grew up with the Walpuri and Kaiditch and Alyara and Warramunga people in a time when they remembered their first sight of Europeans and their first sight of cattle and the first fences that crossed their country. They took me onto their country, they told me stories, and I lived the most remarkable childhood, full of stories about this country, full of other languages. I spoke Walpuri badly, but I did. I didn't have to wear shoes, and I got to kill things and eat them. Basically, best childhood ever. And I didn't go to school terribly often. My mother hates it when I say that in public, but it's true. And it's an incredibly long way from Ali Karong in Central Australia to Silicon Valley, where I have in fact spent the last 18 years of my professional life, and indeed part of the last 2 as well. And the usual story about how I got from Ali Karong to Stanford is, not so unusual. Good kid, did well, tested well, went to university, got scholarship, got to Stanford. Yeah, okay, fine. How you get from Stanford, where your PhD topic is the ethno-history of a Native American boarding school that ran from 1879 to 1918, and where you spent a blissful year of your life ensconced in the American National Archives with 72 linear feet of records. Oh, excellent. How you get from there to Intel is a complicated thing, but really is a very Australian thing too. It involves a man in a bar, which means I'm not a person to ever ask for career advice. Because I landed my job at Intel because I met a man in a bar, and he, in true American fashion, asked me what I did, because that is the opening gambit in American bars. I told him I was an anthropologist. He said, "What's that?" I said I studied people for a living. He said, "Why?" I possibly should have guessed at that point he was an engineer. I didn't know better yet. I said I studied people because they were interesting. He said, "What do you do with that?" I said, "I am sure smugly, I'm a professor at Stanford." Or in fact, I think I probably just said, "I'm a professor," because Stanford was a bit much at that point. And he said, "Couldn't you do more?" And I thought, yes, I could stop talking to you, because you're horrible. And I left. And I didn't think anything more of it until he called me at home the next day, which was striking because I hadn't given him my phone number. And we are talking about 1998. So before Twitter and Facebook and Tinder and LinkedIn and even Google. So we are talking before the white box on the internet into which you could have typed red-headed Australian anthropologist, which is what this man said when he called the anthropology departments in the Bay Area looking for me. And Stanford said, "Oh, do you mean Genevieve? Do you want her home phone number?" So the reality is I got my job at Intel because of poor privacy practices and hanging around in bars. I kept my job at Intel because it turned out getting to work in a tech company that was building the future was one of the best gigs I could ever have imagined. And that getting to be part of conversations about what the future might be like and what the role of people should be in that, and more importantly, what the role of culture should be in that, was an extraordinary opportunity and a very heavy responsibility. I came home to Australia 2 years ago because 18 years in Silicon Valley left me with the faint thought that possibly the people in Silicon Valley shouldn't be the only ones building our future, and that some of the logic that Silicon Valley is riven with might not be the logic of all of us, and that it is very hard to build change in the center of the machine. Sometimes you need to be at a little bit of distance from it. And I thought to myself, well, 50 years ago, Jeffrey Blaney said the tyranny of distance, maybe I can use that to my advantage. And I came home. And I came home specifically with the idea of thinking about what might it be to build and maintain a critique of artificial intelligence and all the other technologies therein and create room in that conversation for human beings without having to have the only room be the word ethics. So I thought we might need more room in that conversation. So all of that means whilst I am not an expert in AI, I certainly know more about it than your average bunny and certainly more about it than most anthropologists, so I thought I might tell you a bit about that and tell you why I think that the relationship between this next generation of technology and the idea of art and wonder is not as strange as it might first sound. And I want to do that by telling you some stories. And I thought I'd start with an Australian one because I'm home. So those of you from Victoria will recognise this object. That is CIRAC. That is Australia's first stored memory computer. It is, depending on whose history you pay attention to, the second or fourth stored memory computer in the world. It was certainly the second stored memory computer in the world to be built. It was the fourth stored memory computer in the world to be turned on, because in the 9 months between when it was built and when it was turned on, Australia suffered from chronic power shortages. And this machine was left unable to be powered, because we're talking about, this one was turned on in 1948, 1949, initially in Sydney, at the University of Sydney. It was built by a man named Trevor Pearcey. It was a novel design. It was unlike the earlier stored memory computers of Philadelphia. This one had mercury acoustic delay line valve technology. The only reason you need to know that is that it was slightly less power intensive and it made a noise. This is relevant to this story. In an inexplicable move, the University of Sydney decided in the early 1950s that there was no future in computing, and they gave this object away. The University of Melbourne, in a move that is possibly prescient, went, ooh, we'll take it, and put it on a truck and sent it to Melbourne, where it took a year to reassemble it because we are talking about 2,000 mercury acoustic valves that are this long that had to be arrayed in a rack very, very carefully. And because they were full of mercury, that was also a little bit dangerous. This object here was probably 2x the size of this stage. It was very, very heavy. It took about 5 suburbs worth of electricity to power it. So it was a little power intensive. When you turned it on, it took about an hour to go through all of its cycles to boot up. There is a moment in booting this thing up where you had to stand there as the motor started to turn with a spanner on the fan belt until it got to right about the right tension. And any of us who grew up in country Australia know exactly what that's like. It is like tuning the thing with your ear, and all the guys who do it knew exactly how much tension and everyone else didn't. It also meant, because it took an hour to power up, that if you accidentally plugged in the kettle in the lab, you short-circuited everything and had to start again, and no one loved you. It also means, because the way this worked, that in order for the signal to be carried, basically to make zeros and ones inside this computer, you used to have to heat the mercury. The mercury had to be heated to 40 degrees Celsius so that it would function. Pause and think about the summer we've just had, and imagine we're talking about the 1950s and there was no air conditioning. Turned out in Australia in the 1950s, computing was a winter sport, and it basically stopped when the cricket started, because you couldn't air condition the lab and the ambient air temperature got to the same temperature as the computer and it all just became non-functional. Anyway, this computer here did many things. It was Melbourne, so you'll be happy to know it did routinely calculate the winning odds for the Melbourne Cup. It's also responsible for working out everything from the dimensions of the Maya Music Bowl to notions about mortgage rates to ideas about the weather. It was a fully functioning computational object for a very long time. But the reason I have it here is not because we should be justifiably proud of CIRAC, because it was a modern marvel and it taught an entire generation of Australians about computers. No, it's here because when it was relaunched in Melbourne in 1954, 55, they decided that what they should do was make it play music. Because to make zeros and ones in this machine, it pinged. It actually made an out loud noise. And so Trevor Pearcey and his colleague worked out how to make it sing. And because it was the 1950s, you can imagine the choice of music here wasn't stellar. Basically, the first tune it played out was the theme song for what would become the movie The Bridge Over the River Kwai. We all know that tune. It did that. The Age, in its review of this musical interlude, declared that it was like a refrigerator, the door of which had not been properly shut. It's not what you'd call a ringing endorsement. But it went on to perform music over about a 5-year period, and as far as anyone knows, it is the first computing object on the planet to make music. It wasn't designed to make music, it was designed to crunch numbers. But the people who built it worked out that you could do something else with it. It's also coincidentally the first computer on which someone played computer games, because see all those, the little blue circles there? You could chase the noise across them. They're oscilloscopes, basically, so you could see the noise running. And one of the early caretakers of this computer, a woman, worked out how to play a game that sounds suspiciously like Pong, where you would set the computer up to move the dots backwards and forwards across the screens and you would chase it. She's Australia's first gamer and she was better than the machine, which I think is kind of genuinely excellent. Anyway, so music, first computer, not designed for it, someone worked out how to do it. And it was considered to be a sufficient spectacle that they kept working it out, and people actually worked out how to tune this machine with decreasing degrees of care to make it keep making music. So it sat in the basement at the University of Melbourne for many, many years, making music and calculating the odds for all kinds of things. It doesn't do any of those things anymore. It sometimes sits in Museum Victoria behind a wall where you can still see it. The men who ran it, there's at least 2 of them still alive, and they talk about the fact that when it was running, it was like a living thing. It heaved and creaked and groaned, and it smelt like dust and enamel paint and oil. And they all talk about the day when it was turned off for the last time, that it was like someone dying. Because it wasn't just a computer, it was a part of, in some ways, the way the work was done, but also the way experiences were being made. So that's 1952. In Australia. In 1956, in America, a group of mathematicians, for the most part, and scientists gathered at Dartmouth College in New England with the explicit charter of thinking through how might it be that you would take advantage of computing power. Because between CIRACs as the first stored memory computer in Australia and 1956, the world of computing had changed dramatically. Shockley had invented, effectively, the integrated circuit. You now didn't need these massive valves. You didn't need all that electricity. Computers were getting smaller and faster. And the rate of growth in 1956 seemed infinite. And for a number of people who had been working with those big, clunky, old computers, particularly in America and also in Britain, there was an open question about what the future would hold and about how might you think about where those objects were going and what you could do with all that power. Because one of the things you need to know about the history of computers and the history of computing is that it's always been tied up with the notion of brains. The very first computers were described as giant brains. Some of the very first computational objects were described as being brain-like. The very first object that ran algorithms, although not in a computing sense, not with zeros and ones, but in a mechanical sense, was described as the giant brass brain. 20 years later, it became the old brass brain, but it was still a brain. And the notion here of computing and brains is a semantic and semiotic link that was already well established by 1956. Because people were effectively, in the 40s and 50s, using computers in the electronic sense to replace computers in the human sense. Because until 1945, computers were people. In fact, specifically, they were women. They were women who did calculations, they did maths. They did logarithmic tables at speed in large rooms gathered together, particularly during World War II, as a way to aim battleships and guns on said battleships very, very quickly. So until the 1940s, if you said computer, what you meant was someone who did maths. And really, if you said computer in most places, what you meant was women who did maths. Even in Australia, we had women computers at Woomera, we had women computers here in Sydney, and they were everywhere. But in this period of time in the 1950s, the notion of computers has become machines and no longer people. And for the men gathered at this conference in 1956, their challenge was, okay, there's a lot of computers, what are we going to do with them? And they're getting bigger and more powerful and more brain-like, because more powerful, so we should work out what to do with them. And this collection of people decided that what the really end goal here should be was not just more calculations, so not more numbers in, numbers out. Could you do a faster logarithmic table, for instance, or a faster calculation on the odds for the Melbourne Cup? The question was, could you actually ask computers to do something more than that? And for this group that gathered there, they actually put forth this notion of really 4 things that they believed that this next generation of computers could do. They believed that what you could do was make machines use language, and here they mean human language. They believed that they could say that computers would form abstractions and concepts, the delightful dodge that I think comes next, solve the kinds of problems now reserved for humans, and improve themselves. And that agenda is what they called artificial intelligence. They said if a machine could understand human language, form abstractions, do things that we all could only do in 1956, and learn over time, that would make a machine intelligent. And it would, of course, be artificial because it wasn't human. Now, if you want to ask who was in the room and what were they thinking about humans, that would be a relevant question, and it was my first question. I'm like, who was in the room and what did they know about people? And it turns out in 1956, the behavioral psychologist who most influenced the thinking of these people was, wait for it, B.F. Skinner. Yes, cue wry laugh here. Because if you know about B.F. Skinner, he's an American behavioral psychologist. He is writing against the European psychologists of the day, in particular Freud, but probably also Jung. And he was really interested in a notion of the human condition that suggested that humans were like machines. They were electrical impulses in, electrical impulses out. You could have conditioning in the middle, usually operant conditioning, and you could change people's behavior. So if you're a bunch of scientists hoping to make a machine that thinks like a human, it's really helpful to find a psychologist who thinks that humans are just machines. It is like a happy marriage made in some kind of non-religious heaven, or in this case, Dartmouth. And so there is Skinner. There are a bunch of engineers, at this point mathematicians, and early proto-computer scientists, who decided that what made humans human was their intelligence, and that intelligence was simply a series of tasks that you could break down. Now, of course, for the people who funded this agenda, and this is another one of those places where tracing the money is important. Who was funding this work, and what were they getting out of it, and why? Turns out the principal funding for the AI agenda in the United States came from the United States government. And in 1956, if you think about what was the United States government's existential crisis, it was the Russians and the Cold War. And so what were they hoping out of this agenda? Well, they were hoping for a machine that would be able to translate Russian instantly, not simultaneously, instantly. They basically wanted a computer that would understand what the Russians were thinking and be able to do it in a timely manner. Hence the understand language and understand abstract concepts. Big agendas right there. And so an enormous amount of money was put in the 50s and 60s and 70s into teaching machines to be able to hear human speech, to be able to translate, to be able to back translate again, and with a vague sense of could you teach machines to understand symbolic language, which would be everything from the way we use metaphors to actual symbolic things like flags and movements of military personnel. It didn't work terribly well. I'm willing to bet every single one of you in this room understands that the translation of language is not the same as the making sense of language. If any of you speak more than one language or operate across multiple domains, you know that a word in one context does not mean a word in another context. The apocryphal tale that is always told is that this entire part of the AI agenda came to a crashing halt the day the sentence, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, was translated into Russian and back out again, and when it came back as the vodka is strong and the meat is bad. So we had gone from basically an ecclesiastical statement to a restaurant review, and it became clear in that moment that this may not be an agenda quite worthy of pursuit in the manners that had seemed apparent at that point in time, and people who actually spoke Russian continued to have jobs. All of which is, of course, to say that translation isn't quite the same as sense-making, right? And being able to use human language isn't simply a matter of writing down a word and knowing the alternatives for it. It's also about what is the meaning and context that sits behind all of that. Nonetheless, many people in many different parts of the United States and Britain, and to a lesser extent Europe and Australia, continue to pursue the pieces of this agenda. And frankly, if you were sitting in 2019 as we are now, you look at those and think, well, maybe not in 1956, but in 2019 we've gotten much closer. There are a set of computational objects that surely at least understand human speech, imperfectly, but between Siri from Apple and Google's Hello and Amazon's Alexa, we have machines that at least can make sense of our speech patterns, even Australian ones, sometimes. We know that there is a certain capacity to form abstractions and concepts, think about how computer vision works. So how does a computational object know it is you at the gate to let you through at the Sydney airport, or whatever the thing is, right? There is some rendering there. There are certainly problems that computers solve that were once resolved for us. I'm willing to bet many of you got here using Google Maps. Many of you probably used other functions on your computational objects in the last 48 hours that at one point you did the hard way. We don't need to do those things anymore. And it is certainly the case that computational objects are learning for themselves. About 2 kilometres from here going that way, there is a brand new building structure, the Barangaroo Towers, that have a set of lifts in them that are artificially intelligent, and those lifts behave differently now than they did 2 years ago, simply based on the patterns of the people that have been in that building. It's a little unnerving for the people in the building to realise that the lifts are in fact learning over time and changing their behaviour. That would be the lift's behaviour. I'm willing to bet the human's behaviour is changing too. So, 1956, it was a big call. By 2019, some of these things seem possible, but it wasn't a straight line through, right? There were multiple moments in time when people wanted to imagine something else for computing and where alternate voices emerged and alternate kinds of pieces. For me, this is one of the most provocative. This was produced in 1967 and first displayed to the world in 1968. It comes from a group in Tokyo called the Computer Technic Group. They were a collection of artists sponsored, interestingly enough, by IBM. They were computer scientists and artists. They had a manifesto they wrote in 1967. One line in that manifesto reads, "We will tame the computer's appealing, transcendent charm and restrain it from serving established power." It's an interesting idea. 1967. 1968, this piece of art appears. This is called Return to Square. If you notice, it starts with a square and ends with a square, but in the middle it goes through clearly a figurative illustration of a woman's head. This was made with an IBM mainframe. This was done using Fortran. So, exactly, a very banal programming language written exclusively for IBM, which is effectively what my colleagues would call a touch metal language. So it was a language that was very, very close to the machinery. But someone worked out how to manipulate Fortran the way they worked out how to manipulate Cyrac, not just to crunch numbers, but to make art. What's fascinating to me about this piece was that it appeared in an exhibit in 1968. That exhibit first went live in London, in the Design Museum on the Thames. It then took its way to the Museum of Modern Art in New York and ended up in the Exploratorium in San Francisco. It was part of an exhibit called Cybernetic Serendipity, curated by a woman named Jasa Reichart, and it was an entire exhibit of computer-generated art. So, haiku written by computers, slightly weird, very creepy. A bunch of art made by computer programs, some of it beautiful, some of it weird. More computer music, more computers making art, more use of lights and graphics. And here's the thing. In the computer field, no one remembers this exhibit. In the graphics field, some people do. But this was happening at the same time as the most important demo in computer science to date, in which the mouse and the internet were displayed in San Francisco directly across the street from this exhibit. But here you have in 1967 people imagining computers might make art, right? And not just imagining it, but making it. So in some ways, my challenge to myself and my kind of provocation to all of us is to say, it is easy to be seduced by the notion of the artificial intelligence agenda, right? The idea that machines will understand language, that machines will understand abstract concepts, do things that we only once knew how to do, and maybe learn for themselves, because it's already happening. What might it be to wonder, too, about how you might, to borrow the phrase from 1967, tame the computer's appealing transcendent charm? What would that look like? Well, here are 5 places that I think that's happening and some ways that it might look like, just as a kind of way of saying, I don't think this has to stay in 1967, 1968. I think there are ways of pulling it through. So what would it mean, right? And this is not me saying, will the robots be artists? Because that's always a tempting question. This is also not me saying if the robots became artists, it would kill art or kill us, because those are usually the next set of questions. And if any of you are worrying about the robot apocalypse, I don't mean this glibly, but it is still the case that the largest install base of robots on the planet is the robotic vacuum cleaner. And here's the thing about robotic vacuum cleaners, they don't have knees, which means they can't climb stairs. If you're old enough, that means they are like the Daleks from Doctor Who. You'll be safe for a little while. But it turns out the Roombas actually made that. So, a performance and new media artist in Japan named Jade 2 hacked a Roomba. He replaced the dust-sucking vents and turned them into paint-blowing vents, so he reversed the flow. He filled the places where dirt would be collected with paint, and he then released them back onto the floors from which they had come, where they traced out the patterns of collecting the dirt with blowing out paint. I'm not recommending you do this at home. I think that would be chaotic and interesting. But what is fascinating here is that someone said, well, okay, what would it be to take computational platforms, a la what we did with CIRAC, and reimagine them in something slightly less instrumental? What would it mean to hack effectively the computer platforms of today and turn them into things that maybe it's not art in the traditional sense, but it's certainly something unexpected and interesting. It is, at the very least, a different form of data visualization. It is, at the very least, a way of manifesting your dirt in a way, or at least the collection of your dirt, in a way that suggests something, for me, particularly interesting. Of course, you heard 2 people stand up on stage here before I even spoke and talk to you about what it meant to digitize data, how it would engage scholarship and create new ways of seeing patterns and new kinds of ways of seeing things. And that, of course, raises new challenges about how do we want to represent that data. But I think it also unleashes the possibility of other ways we can use that data both to, I would suggest, create and critique art. I'm thinking here in particular about the work of Deb Verhoeven and her colleagues of looking at the data about granting bodies and the recipients of government research funding, and about the ways you can map that and basically demonstrate the persistence of certain forms of social practice, basically patriarchy, not to put too fine a point on it, and that you can use that data and the patterns of that data to start to ask different questions about perhaps who might make art and whose voices are missing from the equation. But that suggests that the relationship between art and data is a complicated one, right? We certainly have data visualization forms. We have ways of using data differently, but we also have data to ask us uncomfortable questions about who gets access to all this new technology, who gets access to the money, and what the consequences are for the art that is being made, or more importantly, not being made. So how might we want to think about that in everything from who is funded by the Australian Film Institute, by all the other film institutes around the world, about what voices are in and out of the frame. And again, to go back to that 1967 question about whether that means it's serving established power or not. So how might we use the very sources of data that we are collecting to ask a whole set of different questions, not just about the past, but about the present and the future? And if you did, and it was discomforting, what would you do differently? And frankly, many of you sit in institutions that not only curate that history, but are responsible for that present and that future, and how you think about that is uncomfortable, but incredibly important. It's not just a matter of who's in the collections, but it's a matter of knowing who isn't and why, and what one might do about that moving forward. It's also the case, if you think about how AI could be composed, that if data is kind of, artificial intelligence's original sin, it is the thing it most needs, but it is the thing that most shapes it too. Bad data doesn't necessarily make for good AI. Part of the way data is framed inside artificial intelligence is by algorithms. And algorithms aren't that complicated. They are merely the automating of a process or a task. They are if A, then B, and C, and an outcome. If you've ever used a washing machine, you have already encountered an algorithm. Every time you picked the delicate cycle, someone has predetermined the delicate cycle equals cold water, not a lot of spin, very little agitation, and only one rinse. That's an algorithm. It's very straightforward. It means you no longer have to push all the buttons on the washing machine, you just push the one. And someone determined what the setting was behind that button. At one level, that's all an algorithm is too. Someone has determined a setting that sits behind whatever the automation is. Now, of course, there's three problems there, right? What was the sequence that was being automated and who decided that was the right one? What went into determining that sequence? And is that sequence visible in such a way that you can tweak the settings if you need to? On a washing machine, it's one thing. It's another thing to imagine that is now an algorithm that is determining your access to the country, a service, a loan. We may sometimes joke about, well, sure, it's determining what I watch in terms of content, but that in turn drives the content that is being produced. It's not that long ago that Spotify, the music streaming service, had to admit that there was an entire set of work sitting underneath their algorithms that was tuning what people listened to and producing a kind of monotone experience for most of its listeners. If you liked this, then you liked this, and the challenge there was that you just kept liking things that were remarkably similar. And given what I know about the people in this room in particular, I'm willing to bet most of us have had at least one experience, and probably many more, of a moment when we didn't end up where we thought we would. We took a left turn instead of right, we went north instead of south, we went to a different place in the stack because we weren't really paying attention, and we found something gloriously unexpected. And I'm willing to bet almost every single one of you remember what that felt like, of a moment of the thing not turning out the way you thought it would, or of the thing that you would never otherwise have done, but somehow you did it anyway. And it was an extraordinary moment. One of the challenges with the way many of these algorithms are being constituted is they make it quite difficult to have those moments of serendipitous discovery, because what it is effectively an algorithm of familiarity. If you liked this, and you liked this, and you liked this, it's basically same, or familiar. And the familiar is seductive, right? There are reasons we talk about things like comfort food and comfortable clothing, because there's something nice about those things. But the reality is some of the most instructive learning experiences we ever had are when we are discomforted. So, the challenge here is twofold. What might it mean to work out how to create an algorithm that occasionally surprised you is an interesting question. Rather than thinking about familiarity, how might you think about discomfort? And of course, the temptation here would be to make that happen every Tuesday at 4 p.m, and you'd need to resist that. But for those of you who are new to Sydney or who have been somewhere else recently and pulled out your phone looking for something, imagine if the map said, yeah, as it would always say to me, we know you're looking for the nearest good coffee, but we're going to take you over here first because there's a piece of public art you should see and it's beautiful, and you should stand in front of it before you go get your coffee, you busy little thing. And if it did that every time, I'd get really shitted off. But if it did it occasionally, I think I might think that was splendid. And there is something about how might we imagine what it meant to create algorithms for discovery rather than just familiarity. Now, take that one step further and suggest what might it mean to create an algorithm of discomfort. Because after all, that is partly the function of, I would suggest, certainly the arts and frequently the education sectors. We should be asking harder questions, not serving you up all the same things you already know, but things that challenge you. Now, of course, it's hard to think about what that would look like in the world of business. It's not really in someone's business model to show you things you don't like and have you leave the platform. That seems counterintuitive to the logic of late capitalism. Nonetheless, what might it mean to think about serendipitous discovery? What might it mean to think about how you used the same technology that finds patterns to find discontinuities and to serve those discontinuities up? You thought you were looking for all the things that are the same, but here is this thing that isn't like any of those things, and rather than imagining that is noise, maybe that is in fact the signal. And for many of us who do research of all kinds, or at least maybe just for me, there is a moment when you are looking at things where there is a thing that is not like everything else, and you know in your gut that means something. The fact that it doesn't look like everything else is what makes it interesting. For many of these algorithmic objects, if it doesn't look like everything else, it's noise. It's the thing you discard because you were looking for the things that are like everything else. And the smaller that object is that is different, the less likely it is to be surfaced. So thinking about the paradigms that underlie some of these algorithmic objects is actually hugely important. And it doesn't mean all of us need to learn to read computer programs, though we probably ought to learn to work out how they function. And frankly, much of the algorithmic and machine learning world is just maths and statistics. But knowing how those things function lets you ask better questions about what it means to have these things sitting in your institutions. And I frankly think we all have a responsibility to ask better questions in that regard. And then there is the question, thinking back to my 1956 Dartmouth clue, who said the machines will learn. What does that actually mean? Learn in which sense? Not learn necessarily in an embodied sense, though many of these computational objects have ways of collecting data from the physical world. They have an embodied sensibility, if not a body. They're not necessarily learning the way many of us learnt by watching the faces of our peers and going, oh, that wasn't a good answer at all, or through shame or embarrassment or pleasure. But they are learning by increasing ability to find patterns, by being introduced to new data sets. Some of these computational objects are learning by effectively discoursing with each other. There's at least one set of computational objects in London that are teaching each other things absent humans in the loop. And the consequences of that have been interesting, partly because the humans don't understand the language or the way in which knowledge is being transmitted, and also because, as Turing anticipated, but Minsky and McCarthy never did, the computers are creating their own way of being intelligent, not just our way of being intelligent, and so there's an interesting point of intersection there. This image came from an experiment that was performed at Google about 2.5 years ago now, ironically called deep dreaming. Imagine this might have been the first time someone thought that a computer should have a subconscious. And what they did was create a set of algorithms that were designed to re-visualize photographs. Most of them look like some really kind of bad LSD trip. This is clearly a picture of ibex, so like, you know, the happy things on the Serengeti are kind of re-rendered through an attempt to kind of suggest something else. Of course, this was an algorithm. This machine did not, in fact, have an unconscious, but it was an interesting attempt to think about what might it mean to move from a literal interpretation of photos to a non-literal one. Closer to home and in every single one of your pockets, I'm willing to bet there is a mobile phone. I'm also willing to bet that many of you have, over the years, accumulated in your mobile phones predictive text dictionaries that now follow your spelling and predicates in complicated ways. I find myself ranting recently about Jeff Bezos's duck pics, and that was complicated. My machine thinks I mean ducks under all circumstances, because of course I'm at the ANU where there are many ducks, and I type ducks a lot. In that moment, as I typed something completely incomprehensible, I thought to myself, I wonder if my phone has kind of an id here, where it has accumulated a sense of something about me that I do not know about myself, and that it is sort of in some ways manifesting that. So again, whilst I don't want to suppose that these computational objects are learning in a Freudian sense, there is something here about what the machines will learn and precisely how they will do so, and please don't put on Twitter that I was thinking about Jeff Bezos's ducks. I will never live that down. But what it means to think about that means thinking about what are the tools by which these computational objects will learn, what are the circumstances in which we put that, and how does that unfold? Because here's the question, right? Most of you are sitting with and around and custodians of large sets of data. I know we don't like to think about our collections that way, but at one level they are. They are inputs into the future. How those inputs are arranged and how those inputs are made sense of is part and parcel of how the computational objects will learn. And how we choose to teach them and what we choose to teach them becomes hugely important. It also opens up a really complicated debate for me about at what point would we allow that computational objects were finding patterns and that those patterns might be a creative expression, not just an instrumentalist one. Like, what would it mean to imagine that computational objects could make art? Would we allow that? I'm old enough to remember the debates about whether auto-tune was a thing that would make good music, whether you could sample in rap and that was music. I'm just about old enough to think about the debates that went on about whether television was real storytelling. And I think we live in a moment in time when we know that's no longer a sensible question. I certainly remember questions about whether you could read a book on a screen. I have heard my parents and grandparents talk about the debates that ensued about whether photographs could ever be art. about whether movies would ever be artistic, about whether being a set designer was a form of making art. So it is certainly the case that we have always argued about what it meant to have different forms of technology in the scene. I mean, even think back to the introduction of the optical lens in 15th and 16th century oil paintings. You know, do those count as art because you had the square and the image? It's like, well, of course they do, but the debate will continue to persist here. This is a problem. There is then an interesting challenge for all of us in thinking about what might it mean to imagine a world where there is so much possibility and so many ways that are inputs into the object. So the second to last thing that will make artificial intelligence interesting beyond the data and the algorithms and the way the machine will learn is how it aggregates more information beyond the information that we initially give it. So how does the machine go and accumulate, the computational object, accumulate more information? Standard ways we already know: cameras, microphones, GPS, keyboards. There are more complicated ones. Ambient sensing. It's certainly the case that at this point there are ways that we can use computer vision to determine everyone who's in the room, not by being able to see you, but by able to see how your bodies break the Wi-Fi. That isn't particularly good in this room, but were I to do this, you could know that I was waving my arms by a camera. If you have the right sensing equipment, you could actually know I was waving my arms because I'm moving the particulates of the air and I am disrupting the Wi-Fi signal. Effectively, we have gotten to the point where computing objects could see through walls when they have become Superman. They could actually see the disruption of the air to be able to infer that I am standing here waving my arms. Imagine an ever-increasing array of objects that can make sense of the world that way. But also imagine that every way of sense-making carries with it an older form of technology or an older set of determinations. The camera in your phone that lets you take beautiful photos, you ought to be posting them and hashtagging them right here. That will make this place happy, and you should. And the photos that you take in Sydney and the photos that you take of yourself and all that kind of array of images, if you do this, or you know someone who does. The camera sitting inside your phone is a set of algorithms. So, see before, it's a set of algorithms. Those algorithms, when those first cameras were put on phones, so by Samsung back in the 90s, all of the original algorithms to think about how to put a camera in a phone, because it's not a mechanical camera, it's not a lens in the way traditional cameras were. The people who built those first cameras and every generation after that, their starting point was Kodachrome. So the film that Kodak made, those of us in the room old enough to remember the pleasures of Kodachrome, it was a beautiful format, it made the most glorious films, it was color like you had never seen really in any other medium. It was glorious. But Kodachrome was a chemical process that had been deliberately, in some ways, structured in order to perform really well under certain sorts of circumstances. So it was already benchmarked, right? In the 1950s, in order to optimize Kodachrome, they took 6 faces and 6 kind of traditional scenes. They photographed them and worked out how to make those things look best in Kodachrome. My face, Rox's face, not yours. Possibly 1 or 2 other faces in the room. We were the faces that Kodachrome was optimized on. Guess what? That means there's a whole lot of faces that Kodachrome did not work well for. Sidney Poitier writes incredibly movingly in one of his autobiographies that whenever he was on set in Hollywood, he was always sweating because they had to put 4 additional spotlights on him to find the lines in his face, because the Kodachrome wasn't optimized for a black face, it was optimized for color contrast on a white face. The reason that Kodachrome looks like that isn't from the 1950s. It's actually based on the very history of when cameras were developed by Matthew Brady, or optimized by Matthew Brady in the Civil War in America in 1862. So, the camera in your phone now carries with it a history from 1862 and from a set of decisions that were made then about what was an interesting photographic subject now carried forward. Think about every other sense-making tool that will be deployed to make the future has something not dissimilar lurking inside of it. If you're my size, without heels, you can stand in front of most doors in this country and not be let in. Yes, you know, you have to wave your hands and the door finally goes, oh, you're there. That's because the door is optimized for a certain height and we're not it. And in fact, it turns out the only good news about that is if you are over the delta as well, you have to do the same thing. So my male colleagues who are 6'6" are similarly challenged, and I find some faint pleasure in that. But those doors are designed around the optimum human size, and it's a range, and we're not in it. Or I'm not in it in that particular instance. Now think about every other tool that has imagined in it an ideal world, an ideal body, an ideal outcome. And think about what it means to imagine we are building a world on top of all of that. None of it is new, all of it has history. Most of those histories are built on profound inequities. Whether intentional or not is a different question, but those inequities are reproduced and reproduced and reproduced and become increasingly less visible. So we think about what data will be accumulated moving forward and what might be made of it and what the interventions might be. They are complicated. And they require all the tools that in some ways are best inhabited in this room. The tools of being able to provide a historical context and to be able to ask critical questions about who was there at the beginning and who wasn't and why. And who profited and who didn't ask the questions at the time. But as we think about what it means to build something moving forward, all I keep thinking about is how we ask those questions and who should ask them and how those questions get listened to. And what it would mean not just to ask the questions, but to start building something that reflected them slightly better. And then there is the piece about how you might put it all back together again. Because one of the things that we don't talk about terribly often when we talk about AI is what actually holds it together. One of the mysterious kind of semantic things about AI is that whenever you say it, it makes it sound singular, like artificial intelligence, like it's one in the kind of, Terminator fantasy of Skynet going live and killing us all. There's just one that's going to connect everything. But the reality is there's lots of AIs. They sit inside different technologies, inside different companies, inside different governmental regimes, inside different institutions, and they mostly don't talk to each other, like for obvious reasons. Google doesn't want its algorithms talking to Amazon's algorithms. That's not helpful for the business model. You probably, in a vehicle, don't want your entertainment system talking to your braking system. It would be really good to brake now because that would shock them. You're like, no. Like, there's reasons why we don't actually have certain systems in discourse with each other. But the other reality is that what makes artificial intelligence a reality today is that people have found a thing for those pieces to be stitched together for. Why are you collecting data? What is the process you have automated? What are the decisions that you are augmenting in all of that? What are the sensors you are deploying? It is in the service of doing a something. And it's the piece we forget, right? What's the question? Why is that artificial intelligence being enabled and what is the problem it is solving? It's not solving a general problem. There's a reason. What does the Roomba do? It wants to collect dirt. Like, how is it arrayed? It is arrayed to find dirt and collect it, and then put it somewhere else, also to recharge itself periodically, and terrifyingly enough, take photos of your home and possibly share them on the internet. So, the purpose of that AI is to clean, or at least collect dirt, because those are not the same thing. Now imagine every artificial intelligent object has a similar logic sitting inside of it, right? They have different strategies, different intentionalities, different programs, different reasons they have been empowered and enabled. And at the moment, many of those are programmatic, but not all of them. There is a remarkable amount of work going on in many places around the world at the moment looking at virtual reality and augmented reality with an idea of stitching together all of those things to create different kinds of experiences. This comes from one out of London that's at the Saatchi Gallery at the moment. It's one of the most interesting pieces of VR I've seen of late because, in fact, you don't have to be in the headset to have an experience of the world that is being built, because one of the usual challenges with VR is in the headset is the only person who can see it, and it can be a very alienating experience and a little bit, I think, disconcerting. This one is interesting because inside the headsets you see one thing, outside you see a piece of it, but what you actually see is both humans experiencing it and changing it, and you getting to see it too. And it's an install about a third the size of this room. And it was really quite lovely as a kind of attempt to think about those things. And it was, for the participants in it, this very interesting moment of basically climbing a tree and having the tree breathe in and out and being able to kind of, get to the sort of the surface. And those of us who are outside the VR could kind of see a world emergent and contracting. It was quite beautiful. And it was the latest technologies being strung together here, all of those pieces. It was a set of data inputs, it was a set of algorithms making determinations, there were new sensors on board every single person here. It was really quite something. And it reminded me that there are ways of taking contemporary technologies and doing other things with them. part of the group that I was there with was the Royal Shakespeare Company in London. And 2 years ago in my old job at Intel, we had partnered with the Royal Shakespeare Company to instrument The Tempest at Stratford for the 400th anniversary of that play. And Shakespeare had always imagined that play to be just a little bit crazy. It's kind of a delightfully odd play in many ways. And the Royal Shakespeare Company had approached Intel and Imaginarium, the people who did Lord of the Rings, to ask what it would mean to think about making that play dynamic in a kind of 21st century way. By the time it was finally staged in November of 2016, there was more compute in the globe in Stratford than it takes to keep the space shuttle in space, which was a little disconcerting for everyone. We had real-time motion capture. So in fact, rather than doing it in CGI, so rather than doing it in post-production, we were actually capturing aerially in real time and making him fly across stage every night and twice on Saturdays. And by the end of the first run, Ariel stopped moving like he was human. He'd started to move like he could fly. And the creative director at the Royal Shakespeare Company, Greg Doran, said to me, he said, I don't think Ariel realizes that he's not actually flying. In fact, he thinks he can fly. It's become a bit of a worry for insurance. And I sat in the audience on opening night, and I picked a seat where I wasn't with anyone I knew. And I listened to people respond to a play where suddenly you could see the ship sinking and the bodies floating down from the sky, and where Ariel flew, and where the oak tree was there and cracked open and he fell out. And it was remarkable. And it was a moment where I thought, here is the computing technology I've spent 20 years building being used for a completely different purpose, being used to make magic, being used to take an old text and find a new way through it, and being used to do something beautiful. And, there was a lot of hard computation sitting in the background and a lot of technicians going, we've never had to do this. This is really hard. Oh, my God, why does he need to keep doing that? Couldn't he just do that once in a year? You're like, no, he's going to do it every night. I'm like, oh, my God. It was kind of wonderful to think, what might it mean to imagine all of the technologies that are being built being put to some slightly different purposes? What might be the story you would use to hold it all back together again, right? If it wasn't just a story about signal, but also a story about noise, if it wasn't just about instrumental, but it was also about magic, if it was about the appealing transcendent charm and not established power. Now, I'm not naive enough to think those are ever the oppositions, right? That is merely a convenience. But I would like to imagine that what we should be able to do is pull all of those things together, and that it should be okay to say of next generation technologies, we don't just want to know how you're going to get the work done, we want to know how you're also going to make magic with us, through us, sometimes for us, and that those should be reasonable questions to ask. And so I just want to end with what my own commitment to that has been, because I think it's important not just to ask those questions, but occasionally to answer them. So I started at the outset by saying I came home 2 years ago to do something, and that was probably pulling my punches. I came home 2 years ago because I believe that the technologies that form artificial intelligence are, in fact, a pivot point in history. They are as significant as Newcomen's steam engine and the moment when computers stopped being stored memory and became mainframes. And that there is something in what all of that means that requires us to think profoundly differently. Each one of those moments in our technical history over the last 250 years resulted in the creation of new bodies of knowledge and new practitioners and new questions. And my sense is this is one of those moments, and at this particular moment in time, we aren't thinking about it that way. And so when the ANU approached me, and in a very Nugget Coombs move said, young lady, it's time to come home, and I said no, I had to think about what might bring me back. And I realized what would bring me back was the ability to build something new. And so my stated goal, as ambitious and insane as this might sound, is I should think we need to build that new set of knowledge to manage what it means to take AI to scale for humans, not just for the machinery. And so I put my hand up to build a new applied science, a la computer science, a la engineering. Like all the other times, we have built something big at scale to manage the complexity of the machinery that is coming. And I know that sounds insane, but I decided it needed to happen. I thought it would be good to have a social scientist in the middle, and I thought it might be interesting to have a woman do it, not a bloke. So that's what I am doing. At the ANU, we have a new centre. It's about 14 months old, is that right, Rox? Yep, about 14 months old. Our principal goal is to build a new applied science to manage AI safely to scale. I am taking the best of what I know from Silicon Valley and hopefully shedding the worst. which means rapid prototyping without some of the other craziness. In order to get to a better answer, I figured, why wait until I knew the answers perfectly? We should build them in real time. And so in October of last year, I convinced the university to let me trial a master's program for this year. An iterative curriculum. We have a curriculum, but we figured that the students will break it. We put out a call on social media only because it was very last minute. We ran that call for 5 weeks. At the end of 5 weeks, we had 176 applicants from all over the world. At that point, we only had 10 slots to give. A little scary. We managed to convince the university to give us 16, and those students arrived yesterday. So 16 students from all over the world. They range in age from 25 to nearly 60. They're 50% male, about 60% Australian-born, but from all over the world. They have spent their time doing everything from teaching maths in the Northern Territory to running theatre here in Sydney, to starting the first makerspace in Adelaide, to being senior leaders in the public service, serving members of the military, senior leaders in large American tech companies, and entrepreneurs founding their own companies. And they're bound together by only one thing. They too want to build something different than the world we have now. Because here's the real thing I learned in Silicon Valley, because I always used to get asked, and I will end with this thought. I routinely get asked if I'm optimistic or pessimistic about the future, and I always think that's a, in some ways, foolish question. But an easy one to get sucked into answering, right? Because, see, robot apocalypse is always an easy way to kind of be pessimistic or naively optimistic about the future. My preferred stance is to say the only way I can think about the future is to say I want to build one. And the only way I know how to build one is to build one that I hope will be better for all of us than the one we find ourselves in now. And if we don't choose to act, the world we have now will become the world that happens next, because the thing about data is it's always retrospective. It's always what has been, not will be. And if we are building a world based on what has been, I don't want to be in it. I want something different. And so that is the commitment my students and I have. We'll see what the next year looks like. We'll see if we can, make the ANU kind of crazy, which would be a good first proof point of success. And stay tuned. There's a newsletter. If you suddenly feel the need to come visit us in Canberra, we would love to have you. And here is my final plea, because I know I'm well over time. It's the other thing I learned in Silicon Valley. So 2 things, really. Just 2 things. Build a future you want to live in. And the second thing is you never do it alone. One of the great, in some ways, lies out of Silicon Valley is the story of the lone hero doing things by himself, and the reality is every one of them had help. And I am not foolish enough to think I can do this on my own, nor, frankly, do I want to. So, I need help. If you decide you want to build a future that's different from the one you're in now, you can't do it by yourself. And frankly, most of you sit inside institutions that are critically important to the world I think we need to build. So I guess my deep plea on a Tuesday morning in Sydney is help. And with that, I'm going to stop and say thank you.